Please be seated. The subject today is sin. That's what the S word is, in case you didn't know. I see from many of your faces that I have your attention. That's a good thing. So, how many of you believe in sin? Okay. How many of you are in favor of it? Little dishonesty going on here. That's all right. How many of you practice sin? Engage in. Well, for those of you who engage in it, are you getting better at it? Well, I think there are a lot of different ways we could go here today with this subject of sin. So let me ask you for a little direction here. How many of you would like me to stay away from certain sins that might be a little personal? One honest guy in the bunch. All right, good. Well, or how many of you have some favorites of other people that you'd like me to hit extra hard? Or how many of you would just like to drop the subject and go on to butterflies and flowers and things? Okay, very little honesty today. Okay. Well, as much as we might like to not talk about sin, sin is the focus in both of these readings this morning, from the Old Testament and from the Gospel. So here we are, face to face with a rather unpopular subject that nobody really wants to talk about. However, as we can't avoid it, okay? But as I looked at these readings for today, and got into them and thought about them and went off on some rabbit trails and whatever, some troubling questions kept coming up in my mind. Like, for example, we all know, of course, that the law in the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments and the Levitical law, and some places in the New Testament forbid certain sins, like adultery, for example, like David committed in the first reading. And of course, you probably know that the law says whoever commits adultery, what is the punishment? Death. They're supposed to be put to death. If that were true, we'd probably have not a population problem in our world today. So here's David. He commits the sin. He commits adultery with Basheba. And Samuel the prophet confronts him, and David says, "You got me, I did it." Yeah, Barbara?
Nathan, not Samuel.
I'm sorry, Nathan. You're right. You're right. Thank you. Thanks for correcting me. Nathan, yes.
And David also committed murder.
Don't get ahead of me. But you're right. David did commit murder. But in spite of the fact that the law in several places in the Bible pronounces death, a death sentence for whoever commits adultery and murder, of course, where in the story do we read that David was put to death because of his adultery and his murder? We don't. We don't. David eventually died, as everybody dies, but he was not put to death because of his sins. He fell right into the trap that Nathan set for him. It wasn't very subtle. Nathan told the story, and David got all up in arms. That guy ought to die. He's, and of course, you're the guy, David. But it seems like that there are two different laws, maybe, for kings and for the high and the mighty, and then for other people, because David did not suffer the prescribed punishment. So that's a little troubling, that David was above the law, as it were, or seemingly above it. But there's another issue that comes up here, and it's this. David admitted his sin, he confessed it, and Nathan told him, God has forgiven you the sin, and you won't die. So he's given a pardon for the sin that he committed. But what did Nathan tell him? There are consequences. There are going to be some consequences. Yeah, you're forgiven. Yeah, you're not going to die. But your child that you conceived and that Bathsheba bore is going to die. But there were also some other consequences. If we read the rest of the story, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks, there are consequences for the entire nation because of David's sin. There are consequences for the entire nation. Because that golden age that David had brought in so recently, the flowering of culture and literature and the arts and a great standard of living for all of the people, that very soon was going to tumble and crumble and not be there anymore. Because very quickly, when David passed the kingship on to Solomon, and Solomon died, the kingdom was divided into two, the northern kingdom and the southern, or Israel and Judah. And within just a few short years after that, the kingdoms were conquered, they were destroyed. The northern kingdom people were carried off, we don't know where, they were dispersed. The southern people were carried into slavery. Jerusalem was practically leveled. The temple was destroyed. And the Bible tells us these were all consequences of David's sin, of the leader of the nation and his sin. They led to the fall of both of these kingdoms. Now, at this point, I find myself wondering, why didn't God just keep David from seeing Bathsheba in her bath? Why didn't God just send a little dust storm, blow some dust in David's eyes so that he'd have to look away and get the dust out? He wouldn't have seen Bathsheba, and all of these consequences would not have come to pass. It almost seems like it's God's fault here that all these things happen, to the nation especially. But the reality is that it's not quite that simple. For the truth is that God normally does not intervene into human history and into the events of history. God doesn't pull our strings as though we were puppets and say, look, you can't go there, you'll get into trouble. There's sin waiting for you. Going to jerk you out of there and put you over here. Sometimes we might wish it were so. But that's not the way God works. But what God does do is establish a moral universe. We live in a moral universe. It's kind of like a big box. We all live in this giant box of God's moral universe. And within this box, there's free will. We can all do pretty much what we want. We can make the choices that we want, but there are moral laws There are boundaries in this universe that God has put us in. There's free will. We can make the choices and do the things that we want. But there are boundaries. And one of those boundaries is accountability. Accountability for the choices that we make. So, I don't think God really blew it by not preventing David from seeing Bathsheba and going down that road. And I don't think the devil made him do it, as many try to hide behind today. Not my fault, the devil made me do it. No, that doesn't work either. David chose, and he had to live with the consequences. And you know, the reality is, now, as then, among the great and the mighty, and among the rest of us, foolish decisions, foolish choices, and dangerous choices, and stupid choices are made by us at various times in our lives. But many times, we think, I got away with it. Nobody found out. Nobody knew. Nobody was hurt by it. And I won't have to answer for it. But sooner or later, there comes a day of accountability when we have to live with the consequences. Maybe they're legal, maybe they're social, maybe they are emotional or relational. But there comes a day when the consequences catch up to us. Maybe it's only sometimes a bad conscience that we have to live with. But that is not a lot of fun many times either. Maybe that's why confession and absolution have persisted down through the church since the earliest days. They survived even the Reformation. Martin Luther, in his reforming, kept the sacraments of confession and forgiveness. He kept them as sacraments. Later, the reformers who came along after Luther decided that we didn't really need those as sacraments, so they kind of got bumped down a couple of notches. But confession and absolution have always been a part of our spiritual and devotional life. They're not used much. Private or personal confession and forgiveness are not used much in the Lutheran Church, not nearly as much as they should be. Although, if you've ever looked through that green hymnal in the front, you'll notice that on page 196, there is a service for private or individual confession and forgiveness. And over the years of my ministry, as I have worked with people and tried to deal with their problems and the things that were troubling them, I have found that people who use the opportunity of confession in whatever form it's used, often these people find amazing peace and comfort and release from that troubling conscience or from the consequences of whatever it is that has plagued us, followed us, maybe dragged us down for so many years. In the New Testament, Jesus promised, "Come to me. Bring your cares, bring your problems, bring your worries to me, and I'll give you rest. Cast your burdens on me, and you will find peace." That really works, folks. It really and truly does. We also heard it expressed in the song that we read today. Getting rid of that sin, sharing it with God, casting it on God, really does make us free and comfortable. If you haven't used confession and forgiveness in whatever form, maybe you've never used it, or maybe you haven't used it in a long time, I urge you to do it. Give it a chance. Be strong enough to cast your care on God. It may be that you'll find that peace, that comfort, that strength in your life. Amen. As we approach